Welcome back. I'm Austin Westfall. Let's get the latest on the Israel-Hamas war. Let's bring in Dr. Alon Burstein. As always, Alon, it's good to see you. We want to take a live look at Jerusalem on what is Friday morning Israel time. Lots to talk about today. A new round of talks to end the war began with Egypt, Qatar, and the United States acting as mediators between Israel and Hamas. The stakes of the meeting are huge as the fighting continues in Gaza and hostages remain in captivity, and it feels even bigger because we're still on edge over the possibility of an Iranian retaliatory attack. Do we know if anything substantive came of today's ceasefire talks, Alon?
Good to see you, Austin. We don't know. There were reports that the talks were positive, and that it's being done in good spirits. And while that may sound trivial, okay, so everyone's happy to see each other, that actually does matter because the nature of the talks, the spirit of the talks, often is where things actually it tells us trajectory of are things going to develop. At least are the parties going to continue to sit down? There's a couple of things to factor in, and you already roped Iran into this, which is one of the major ones. Another one to factor in is the fact that Hamas initially announced that they're not going to be part of these talks. They're not interested. And a lot of people were questioning, well, what does that mean? Hamas, anyway, is not part of the talks, right? The talks are with Qatar and with Egypt, and then they take it to Hamas. But Hamas usually had its delegates that were actually there as part of the negotiation. They just wouldn't participate directly. In this case, they said that they're not interested. But when they saw that that threat actually was very empty, that Qatar and Egypt did not take it seriously and continued, they backtracked and they said, we are willing to hear from the negotiators. We're just going to hear after the summit. The summit will take place and then we'll hear after. So that's an important step forward also. Well, initially, Hamas rejected the talks continuing and said, no, we just want a final status agreement already about how the war is going to end. We don't want more negotiations. They backed down from that. So that was a positive step in terms of the negotiations. The positive spirit that's being reported is another step. The question remains, what is going to happen with Iran and Hezbollah? And is their attack going to come regardless of the ongoing talks? Iran said that they would hold off their attacks to see what happens in the talks. Hezbollah said that they explicitly would not. They said their retaliation is going to happen regardless of the talks. And if that does happen, these things escalate very quickly and could destabilize the talks. There were some rumors today that Hezbollah is also reconsidering that there's monumental pressure being leveled on Hezbollah from different regional actors saying, don't mess with the talks while they're ongoing. So it remains to be seen if that's going to happen. What is important to factor in, though, is we're looking at by now over 2 weeks since those attacks that Hezbollah and Iran are going to retaliate for, and the wind is going to go out of their sails at some point. So they're feeling the pressure also, because at some point it's going to be hard for them to justify carrying out that retaliatory attack or something that happened, 2-3 weeks ago. So all these things are coming together in the coming days.
Have we seen any activity from Hezbollah today as these talks began? Have we seen anything happening in northern Israel, southern Lebanon?
So, I hate to say this, but we see more of the usual. The usual is rocket fire. There's rockets that are fired every day by Hezbollah, sometimes barrages of 10 rockets, sometimes barrages of 40, 50. We see IDF retaliations and also initiated airstrikes targeting Hezbollah infrastructure, military structures, sometimes trying to assassinate Hezbollah prominent figures, drone attacks, all that has happened in the last 2 weeks or 3 weeks, ever since that attack in Majd al-Shams in northern Israel. The escalations between Hezbollah and the IDF have increased. So if throughout the war we've seen a pattern of 10, 20 rockets that were fired each day and maybe 10 IDF airstrikes that were carried out each day, in the last 3 weeks, the pattern has been much more 50, 60, 70 rocket attacks, swarms of drone attacks, and IDF strikes that are coming not only in southern Lebanon, but also to the areas of Tzor. We've also seen IDF attacks further north in Lebanon and Baalbek. All of these also happening at a much more increased rate. So that continued today. I hate to say it, that's not news. That's not something new. That's the routine of the ongoing war that is going on between the IDF and Hezbollah. Nothing new in terms of the retaliation that's expected. Nothing of that nature.
So I think a lot of us saw the headline. We apologize for that audio interruption there. It sounded like we had a little bit of an audio issue. I want to ask you specifically about 40,000 Palestinians now being declared killed in the Israel-Hamas war. Let's take that live look out of Jerusalem. We saw that headline come through yesterday. The territory's health ministry is giving us those numbers. And in that same time, throughout the span of those 40,000 Palestinians being killed, they also say over 85% of the population has been displaced from their homes. It does not distinguish between civilians and militants in its toll. Alone, these figures are widely reported in the media, but how reliable are they? Not to say that this war hasn't come at a cost of a crushing amount of innocent lives. It has, obviously, but when numbers are put out by a terrorist organization, are they reliable?
So it's a question I get asked often. In a moment of self-promotion, I'll say I actually just uploaded the video to my YouTube channel specifically tackling the numbers of the Palestinian Health Ministry because it's a question that so many people are asking. Do we trust these numbers? They're widely reported. How do we trust these numbers? So I'll say a couple of things. First of all, the Palestinian Health Ministry in the Gaza Strip, yes, is a ministry of the Hamas-led government. However, historically, it has built a reputation of being far more reliable than the other Hamas ministries, the other Hamas organizations, the military wing of Hamas. This is based also upon historically in the last decade, the escalations and flare-ups between Israel and Hamas. Usually the numbers that were reported by the Palestinian Health Ministry ended up being fairly accurate and matched the numbers that Israel reported. So that's one factor. A second factor is the Palestinian Health Ministry, as you said, does not distinguish between civilians and militants. What it does account for, it simply accounts for bodies. It accounts for, sorry for the gruesome description, it accounts for dead bodies that come through Palestinian hospitals. In most of the international investigations, they have found these numbers to be fairly accurate. Fairly, again, not entirely, there's sometimes discrepancy, but fairly accurate. A third thing to remember is Israel does not report how many Palestinian civilians it thinks have been killed in the war. But in one of the times that Israel alluded to that, in March, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu stated that at the time, 13,000 Palestinian militants have been killed, and that the ratio of militants to civilians is 1 to 1.5, which means that for every militant killed, it was 1 civilian or 1.5 civilian. Those numbers largely match what the Palestinian Health Ministry was saying back in March in terms of how many people were killed. So with all this, the number does tend to be relatively trustworthy. I do estimate that the number of bodies that are accounted for is roughly around 40,000. That said, we also have to take into consideration that the IDF spokesperson, Daniel Hagari, stated today that the IDF estimates that some 17,000 Palestinian militants have been killed in the Gaza Strip. So if we take that as reliable and the Palestinian Health Ministry as relatively reliable, those are the numbers that I would estimate right now is going on in the Gaza Strip. Roughly 17,000 militants killed out of roughly 40,000 Palestinians all told.
I want to ask you about something I know you've been following closely. Hamas's military wing also says that 2 of its guards have shot and killed 1 Israeli male hostage held in Gaza and seriously wounded 2 female hostages. This is an alarming thing to hear. We don't hear headlines of this nature very often. Alone. What do we know about why this happened?
We don't know any information about who the hostage that was executed by the guards was. One thing I will correct, the spokesperson of Abu Ubaidah stated those were 2 separate incidents. He said that the 2 guards executed a hostage they were guarding, and in a separate incident, 2 female hostages were injured. He didn't say if they were injured by their guards or in other circumstances. Since then, Abu Ubaidah, the spokesman of the Al-Qassam brigades, put out another statement in which he said that Hamas is carrying out an investigation into how this happened. He was explicit. He said this was not under Hamas orders. The orders were not to execute hostages. You and I spoke many times throughout the war, and I said, Hamas has a vested interest in the hostages being kept alive. He said this was done against Hamas orders. According to what he said, the guard that carried out that execution just learned about the death of his 2 children in an IDF bombing, and he did this in retribution. That I would not take automatically. I would not believe automatically, because that also fits a narrative that Abu Ubaidah would like to put out. In terms of, are these circumstances true? Is it true that guards executed a Palestinian prisoner? Guards executed an Israeli hostage in the Gaza Strip? I do think that probably is accurate. The organization would not have any interest in publicizing something like that. It makes them look bad also in negotiations. They claim to be humanitarian. The organization would not have any interest in publishing that if that wasn't true. The circumstances that that guard happened to have learned that his children were killed at that moment, and that is why he did that, that I don't take for granted. That may not be true. It is very likely that this happened. We know nothing about who that hostage was. That is something that we don't know yet. If Al Qassam follows their pattern that they have during the war, they will likely put out a video within the next week or two in which they show who that hostage was. They'll probably put out a teaser first. That's what they usually do, saying we're going to reveal the identity, and then they will put out the actual identity of that hostage. One thing they did today, which was a little bit confusing, is they put out a picture of another hostage that was held in the Gaza Strip, stating your cruelty killed him. This was a hostage that was killed already on October 7th, and his body was retrieved already back in November. So it's a little confusing if this was a mistake made by the organization or just trying to sow confusion. But that was put out also. But if anyone saw those images, that is not the hostage that was executed by Al Qassam. That is an entirely different story, and it's unclear why Hamas put that out now.
Ceasefire talks continue tomorrow in Doha. Alon, as always, good to see you. We always look forward to your daily YouTube uploads. Take care.